Warm welcome to what is the fifth instalment of the Brodies Planning Podcast, which comes to you live and interactive from various locations across Scotland today with your host Victoria Lane, who's an associate in our Edinburgh planning team, and myself, Geraint Hughes, a senior solicitor in the Glasgow planning team. Now, as regular viewers may have picked up from Neil's roundup of the last episode, we're very keen to use this platform to present a broad spectrum of insight and to facilitate debates on planning matters in Scotland. And this afternoon is very much evidence of that commitment. We're going to be exploring quite an expansive range of topic areas, including planning and the new normal. What does the future hold for our towns and cities post-lockdown, and what exactly can planning do to aid recovery? Should we harbour reservations or indeed take inspiration from the recent radical reforms south of the border? And how have the Scottish Young Planners Network been adapting to support prospective and existing young planners in Scotland during this period and moving into the future? To help us do all of that, we're very pleased to welcome our guest this afternoon, Rhiannon Moylan, who's a person very well acquainted with all of these topic areas, on account of her being a former local authority planner, now a planner at Montagu in Glasgow, the chair of the Scottish Young Planners Network, and a committee member for the central chapter of the RTPI Scotland. And in her spare time, although I can't imagine she has much left over, she also volunteers with Planning Aid Scotland. So welcome to Rhiannon. Now, the sharp-eyed amongst our viewers will note that we haven't been left completely unsupervised today. Also in attendance and keeping a watchful eye over proceedings, and more particularly the interactive Q&A process, is our very own Karen Hamilton, who's a partner in the planning team. So this session is live, and your cameras and microphones are automatically going to be switched off and muted. That said, it is interactive, and that does allow you to pose questions in the Q&A box, which you should see on your screens, which we would really encourage you to do so. Your queries won't be visible to other guests, and they'll be addressed on an anonymous basis as and when we can during this session. If we don't have time, of course, we'll come back to you separately on those as well. And lastly, in what is quite an exciting prospect, is that this episode, as with the others, is going to be recorded and will be available afterwards on YouTube in perpetuity. So we now know who we all are and what we're all doing. All that's left for me to do is to hand over Victoria to get us started.
Thank you very much, Geraint. It's great to have you with us today, Rhiannon, and thanks again for coming along. Notwithstanding the unprecedented past few months that we've all been living through, 2020 was always going to be a busy one for you, taking over as chair of the Scottish Young Planners Network. To kick off today, we thought it'd be good if you could just tell us all a bit, firstly, about the work of the network, your role as chair in all of that, and a bit about how the network has had to adapt to cope with the lockdown situation.
Hi, so the role of the Scottish Young Planners Network is really just to connect to young planners, so that's anyone in the first 10 years of their career in planning. We provide CPD events and we go out to universities, and we arrange the APC events as well. So it's really a kind of learning and developing tool for young planners to help grow and build their network. As you said, yes, difficult years to come on board. So the changeover was the financial year. So I took over from Lisa, our past chair, in April, just in the middle of lockdown. And the thought of hosting the first virtual meeting was a bit nerve-wracking, but it actually all went really well, and it's all going pretty well so far. It's not been without its challenges. Obviously, some things are quite difficult to do. Networking drop-ins and stuff, that's never going to really work very well virtually. But we have found that some things are actually easier, like the MPF4 events we recently held. Previously, it was planned that would be a kind of full-day conference type event, but instead we broke that down into 4 smaller roundtables. So we were actually able to get a much better discussion going than we would have been in that kind of larger format. The other thing is that for ages, the Young Planners Network have always said we're very aware we represent all of Scotland, but we have all our events in Central Belt, maybe Aberdeen or Dundee, but it's quite limited to where people are. So a lot of planners maybe in the Highlands or in the Islands weren't well represented, and weren't getting that kind of CPD events that other people would be able to get if they were in a more accessible location. So it's given us a real kind of kickstart to get that going and to make sure that we are doing events live, online, however they can be delivered, and just reach out to a much wider audience. So yeah, it's exciting, it's challenging, but it's challenge comes opportunity. So
yeah, I think that echoes our own experience with clients. That is the real positive. Location is no longer an issue. It's all happening on Microsoft Teams or Zoom or your video conferencing platform of choice. So yeah, that is absolutely to take one positive from all of this. I would say we see the same in our work. Of course, by day you are a planner with Montagu Evans. What kind of sectors would you tend to work in, Rhiannon, and what type of work have you seen keeping you busy over the past few months?
Yeah, so it's been a real mix. We've been really busy the past few months. As a firm, Montagu Evans are sector based, so all the disciplines work together to kind of provide the value added service to our clients. I sit in a number of the different sector groups, including the residential, retail and leisure ones. And we're really lucky in Scotland as we get to be involved in kind of everything and anything, which is really good. It means you kind of get to learn a bit of everything, which I enjoy. At the minute, I'm working on quite a mix of things. Got a big residential housing site at the north of Glasgow, working on some new renewable projects and some new retail development as well. And across the team, we're working on some quite big, exciting projects like the new film house, the Haymarket site, and some work in Princess Street as well. So there's loads of good things to be getting involved in.
Yeah. No, that's good, and it's great to hear that pretty major projects are keeping going and looking beyond the current situation. Again, that mirrors the experience we're having here. It's fortunate to see that all sectors, to a greater and lesser degree, of course, are generating work. And I think our own experience, we've seen quite a lot of renewables projects and work coming forward in the past few months. So good to see that all sectors are keeping us busy in some shape or other. So we've talked a bit about how we have all adapted to lockdown in our various roles and day-to-day work. As far as the planning system goes, I think it's fair to say we're moving from an era of interim changes like extending the life of planning permissions, guidance from the chief planner about relaxation of enforcement on a temporary basis, those kind of things, to more longer term changes and reforms to help us get to this new normal or whatever that might be. As Geraint alluded to at the start, last month we saw England announce some pretty bold reforms, firstly to the Youth Classes Order, the biggest change being the creation of a new Class E for youth classes, which is set up as a general commercial business and service use. Thought it might be useful just to give a quick recap for any of our listeners who have not had the opportunity to take a look at these. So this new Class E really is an all singing, all dancing youth class. It covers retail, food, financial services, indoor sport, health, nurseries, offices, basically anything that it is appropriate to provide in a commercial, business or service locality. Now within Class E, changes between the types of use do not require planning permission. So for context, that's the equivalent of combining most of Class 1, 2, 3 and parts of 10 and 11 in Scotland, which is pretty radical. I think it's safe to say. In addition, as if that wasn't enough, there is partial change of use within Class E is allowed as permitted development. So no more grappling with problems such as when your Class 1 sandwich shop becomes a full-blown Class 3 cafe. And last, but by no means least, these changes apply in and out of town and city centre locations. So, a pretty big shake-up, Rhiannon. What is your view of these steps, and do you think Scotland should be considering something similar?
Yeah, very major, and it's going to have a huge impact, and I can definitely understand it. So the desire to have a Class 1 as like the kind of main prominent use in high streets is well established, but I don't think it's particularly reflects the use of high streets at the minute, particularly with the COVID and shopping life changing and people having to maintain social distancing. A typical high street was already falling out of fashion with people moving to online use, and now people are even more reluctant to do so. And I think it's good that the English Times are taking account of this. So in that respect, I would say they're welcomed, but I do think greater management is probably required. Loss of immunity for me would be a real concern, and how premises can be adaptable to accommodate so many uses. So while I recognise that it's acknowledging that the role of a high street is changing and that the use class should be flexible to allow this, I do think there needs to be some better management around it, and I'm not sure how that would work. I think one of the big things for me is something like a shop becoming a nursery. How do you make sure there's play space for children? How is all that going to get factored into, if it's permitted development, there's no assessment of it. So how do you make sure the space is suitable for that use? Another thing, just quite simple, it's something we come up against all the time, is a flu for a cafe or a restaurant. How do you make sure you're not impacting the residential properties above what used to be a shop with a kind of hot food just below? So on the one hand, I can see the benefits. It is really difficult when you're trying to get a cafe into a town centre, and you can't, because it's got a protected class 1 use, even though it's been vacant for however long, and there's strong policy against it. But I do think there needs to be careful thought into how that change is managed.
I think you're right, Rhiannon. Obviously, I'm conscious that given the huge economic shift that has occurred in the past few months, while this flexibility on the one hand is good, we have to think about the types of businesses that will actually be in a position to take up new units once this is all over. And if it's a bit of a free-for-all under this new Class E, we may not see the diversity in the mix that we would ideally like to have. Yeah. That's certainly my concerns. And inevitably, perhaps, problems are already being thought of down south. Things like planning authorities trying to use conditions to restrict the use of Class E in permissions going forward. Also, the difficulty of working out developer contributions when the breadth of the use class and then the permitted development rights under it are so broad. Do you agree with that stance, or do you think actually we should just go for it? Now is the time for change, or would you proceed a bit more cautiously?
I'm a cautious person. I would definitely say I think for some things I can't really see how it's going to be done. I suppose that's maybe part of it. So some of these are we going to have huge lists of conditions on planning applications, and will that actually streamline anything, or will it just become more complicated further down the line if certain things are controlled by conditions and some aren't, and what is and what isn't? Will it just lead to more confusion? So I think there does need to be maybe kind of secondary legislation or further detail into how this could be implemented, because it's such a radical change that it shouldn't really be taken lightly, in my opinion.
I think there's maybe a job to be done as well in terms of bringing communities along with these changes, particularly when governments north and south of the border are keen to do that by way of the changes in community planning, neighbourhood plans down south, and we're looking at local place plans up here. If there's perhaps an expectation amongst communities that they're going to have that greater say in what's happening and changes within their communities, including town centres, you can see there's an obvious tension there.
Yeah.
I think that's probably a useful juncture to remind everyone that this is an interactive session. So if we pose that question to our viewers, do you think that a similar shake-up of the Scottish youth classes is required, or is indeed necessary to act as a shot in the arm for our towns and cities to adjust to the new normal? So yeah, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that one.
Thanks very much, Geraint. Yeah, agreed. Anything that has retrospective effect like this inevitably leads to a lot of work for us. I can see myself spending many an afternoon trying to work out whether an old condition has in fact adequately restricted use going forward. So I can't wait for that. To say. So linked to the use class reforms, if that's the UK government's offering in terms of trying to keep retail and commercial uses in the centre of towns and cities, what trends do you think, Rhiannon, we're likely to see in housing? Again, particularly thinking about younger people and the general trend that we would usually see with young people wanting to stay in the buzz and mix of town and city centres.
Yeah, I think it's always quite difficult to know exactly what everyone would want, because everyone wants something slightly different. But I think two things are quite clear. Is that people want to get on the property ladder, they want somewhere safe to live where they know that they're not going to be faced with rent increases and difficulties along those lines, and they also want to be able to live sustainably. I think that's becoming much more important now. And I think there just needs to be a better offer taking this into account, particularly for people who want to live within walking distance to places where they can shop, where they can work, where the public transport is, where the leisure is. I think that kind of gap is missing in a lot of places. You see a lot of city centres that don't have the residential population within them, and it's all suburbs outside. And I think that re-densification of the city centre is always a good thing. And I think particularly for the younger generation, and probably the older generation as well, who are more want to be closer to people, I think that's where that market would lie.
Yeah.
And I think that planning has quite a big role to play in that. I do feel it's probably more targeted to certain sectors of the population. It wouldn't be for everyone city centre living, but there's a real need for mix and diversification in the type of housing that's provided. You don't really just want old people housing or care homes in one section and then affordable housing in another section, and that's never going to work. It needs to be inclusive. There needs to be a focus on amenity and balance and making sure there's not an over concentration of any particular use in an area.
And hopefully those kind of themes will remain high on the political agenda, given the greater amounts of time we've all been spending in our local area and at home, and the sort of interdependence of different groups within communities on one another. I think you're absolutely right there. Yet again, the UK government are offering a way out of this in terms of housing. You can't really go a news bulletin without seeing a politician in a hard hat and high-vis vest. The theme is very much build, build, build. And again, we've seen a raft of permitted development rights, the most radical of which has been to allow the demolition and rebuilding of redundant commercial residential properties if they are then going to be rebuilt as houses. As you would expect, there are some restrictions in terms of the size of site, the age of buildings, and it's not available in more protected areas like conservation areas or listed buildings, things like that. But still, it's a pretty broad opportunity to allow for new building, particularly on brownfield sites. There's also PD rights coming in to allow upward extensions of existing blocks of flats and also to certain commercial and residential buildings. Again, a similar sort of theme to what we were talking about in the use classes order. Do you think these are the types of interventions that would have a positive impact on the housing issues we're facing in Scotland?
I think they would, in that they could provide more housing, but I don't know if it's necessarily the right way to go. I think too often planning is just seen as an area of red tape and a kind of problem to overcome and a further obstacle for developers, which in some ways it is. And I can understand some of the difficulties from a developer side point of view, but on the same hand, a lot of the planning policy is there to protect people's amenity, to make sure we've got access to open space, to make sure we can go to school, to build communities. And I think in some cases the planning system just kind of needs to take more of a lead and be more visionary in it, rather than sitting back and trying to relax it to get more housing in. I don't always know if that's the right way to go. I think it could definitely be more visionary rather than just trying to relax and let stuff happen and see what goes.
And I think for me, it's quite interesting, as England are going through this, we of course have the consultation that is quite the opposite, considering removing the presumption in favour of sustainable development, which albeit is one element of policy, but if that is modified or removed, arguably there is a reduced drive for housing, certainly through the channel that the presumption supports. So it's quite interesting to see the two countries with fairly different ways of dealing with the issues that they're facing.
Yeah.
No doubt there is more to come in both sides of the border.
Yeah.
I guess to go one step back before the sort of first homes that we were talking about, and I completely agree of the importance of that. Student accommodation has of course been in the news recently, a sector that has and is still experiencing many challenges as the formats of university education for the next academic year continue to be worked out and will no doubt be subject to change thereafter. Do you have any thoughts on student accommodation? We've still seen quite a few developments popping up.
Yeah, so it's something that I'm aware of that people have really negative views on, but it's not something I personally have a particular issue with. I see it as quite a good thing, especially for students moving to a new city, and it's quite an easy transition into that first stage away from moving from your mum and dad to somewhere that's slightly more communal, and you're not just kind of there and left to fend for yourself. So I think it creates a kind of ready-made social infrastructure, and it can feel a bit safer as well for young people just starting out. I also think it does a huge job in helping to keep smaller flats more affordable for younger people who are looking to buy, because they're not then being just changed into HMO flats, which is often what you see in areas where there's not sufficient purpose-built student accommodation. I do appreciate that an overconcentration could have a community impact when it's not managed well. But I don't think you can really step away from the positive impact students can have on a community in an area, particularly in terms of their economic impacts and the support that they can give businesses. I think too quick people are ready to be like, oh, those students partying with all that like noise, when in reality that's never been my personal experience. And I think the positives are often overlooked.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think you're right. So there are, a number of towns and cities in Scotland and beyond that rely on students as an important part of the economy, and it would be a real further blow to those kind of locations. So yeah, obviously one that we'll all be keeping an eye on. Again, linked to your work with the Scottish Young Planners Network, over the past few weeks, the news headlines again across Scotland and England have been dominated by the standardisation of exam results and the impacts on young people of receiving lower grades than predicted. Obviously, we've seen both governments step in to address that, but what are your thoughts on the accessibility of planning and the opportunities for young people looking to get into the profession, Rhiannon?
I think it's definitely something that needs to be worked on in terms of how we promote planning, not even just for getting into the profession. One of my biggest bugbears is that you only ever hear about planning when there's something gone wrong. When there's something people don't like, then it's all about the planners who've done it. You never see the benefits, or there's never the positive promotion of how good planning can be and the real planning gains that can be brought to development. So I think it should really be kind of brought to the forefront as an important part of this COVID recovery, of acknowledging that people now know their communities, now know the people there, now know where their parks are, and know the benefit of having that in their space and place. So I think that should be something that should really kind of come through. And I would hope that one of the things that came through is that young people in particular have got to know their place, got to know their communities, and are starting to realise the importance and maybe take more of an interest in it. So I think we should definitely continue to promote the route into planning, particularly through schools. There's huge links with planning and geography. I know that now feels like ages ago, and I hate to admit that. When I was at high school, when I did my advanced hires, one of the questions was essentially finding a new development site. It gave you a list of criteria, and you had to find the site on a map that could work. But at no point did anyone say that's kind of planning work that you're doing. So I don't know if that's more outreach. I don't know how we get those links, but there's definitely more work, and the RTPI are trying to spearhead that and get more involvement and better links with the Curriculum for Excellence and the planning profession. Another good thing that the RTPI are doing is a lot more work promoting their apprenticeships. So it's a different route into planning. It's not necessarily a degree-based route. It's working on the job and getting the skills that you need, because so much of what you learn as a planner is done on the job. It's not done in those 4 years at university. There's so much that you need to kind of be there and start doing to really get a feel for how it works. So yeah, I think a lot of it's about explaining to people what planning is. It's not just saying, no, you can't build your extension. It's building communities. It's creating places and spaces for people to really kind of live, work, and play, isn't it?
Yep, no, completely agree with all of that. And as someone who actually stumbled across planning quite late, I only found it towards the end of my traineeship. So actually at the very, very end of my legal education, and I sort of stumbled across it by accident, and now wouldn't look anywhere else. At what point in your sort of education or studying, Rhiannon, did you sort of know you wanted to be a planner?
Do you know what? It was actually a complete fluke. So my sister worked for CBRE when I was in 6th year of high school, and she was like, I think you'd make a good planner. I was like, okay. And then I looked into it and actually was like, yeah, I would make a good planner. Like that's the type of stuff I like. And it's that human geography side of things that no one had really sat down and explained to me and said, this could be a job, this could be what you do. And I think one of the benefits of a career in planning is that it's so broad ranging. You can be working in so many different sectors and still be a planner. You could, I think even in my career, so I've gone from working on a strategic plan, a local plan, different types of householder applications, and now working for the private sector, looking at development opportunities. And that's only been 6 years, and I've just continued to learn and grow, which I think is one of the really exciting things about planning.
Absolutely, absolutely. Still, you've packed a lot in, and yet still so much to come. It's really, really exciting. So no, that's great. Again, I'm sure, like us, you have spent more hours online than ever before in the past 5 months. Again, just thinking a bit about the future and sort of the next generation, what are your hopes for the digital legacy that COVID-19 might leave us with in planning?
Yeah, it's kind of just forced everyone to start to move everything online, which is a good thing, I think. I think if it can be done quicker and easier online, then why not do it? Particularly for a lot of the admin tasks that we see. I think the last plan and reform, one of the big things it did was took a lot of time out of admin tasks through technology, and we'd hope that this is what continues to happen. Personal experience is that some local authorities work better than others. Some have better access to technology and use it more than others. And I think hopefully that this will start to standardise it and make people realise that it can work and it can work really well. One of my biggest bugbears is the e-planning system has file limits and stuff, and it can take ages to upload. So there is still work to be done. It could be done easier, but surely that's better than printing out stacks this high of EIA documents or whatever's required. So I can definitely see the point from a planning application and admin side of things. From a consultation point of view, I know that a lot of work for pre-application consultations has been undertaken, and it's had to be done totally online at the minute. But I would continue to promote a more hybrid basis, I would say, because my concern would be that you're limiting some parts of the communities that then don't have access to IT or don't feel comfortable using it. Probably a lot of the people we'd see as the more usual suspects now if you were to go to a consultation event are the ones who would rather go to a consultation event than do it online. And I don't think that it would be right or just to exclude them by having it only online. I think there is still reasoning to do it both ways. But it can be done really well and really successfully online. My colleague Lisa was due to go live with all of her public events the week before lockdown came into force for the Film House development. But what they ended up doing is 4 different Zoom sessions, introduced the team scheme, they used online polls, pre-recorded questions which the public submitted, and the Q&A function on the day using the chat function as well, and it went really well. They've also been able to have really good social media campaign, and they've reached a lot more people online than they ever would have done with a drop-in event. So it's really good on that basis, in that people can get involved, people don't have to spend as much time to get involved. And I really just think it should just be rolled out a wee bit more and more consistently, especially in terms of that admin side with the local authorities.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and hopefully it cuts costs and keeps time delays and things like that down in the future, and we can all benefit from that, whether you're working in the public or private sector. Linked to that theme, the greater use of technology was, of course, the 4th limb of the review of the planning system. If we had magic wands and money trees, what more do you think needs to be done to meet the aims set out in that original paper within the planning system?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing is that greater consistency with how the planning system's delivered online. Different local authorities do it in different ways, and that in itself can be frustrating, is not knowing who does it what way and how are people staffed to work from home. I think it's been another big thing that's came up lately is have they had all the access to all the software they need to work from home or to work flexibly, and the limitations with that. So the hope is that this would show people that you can work from home, you can work remotely, and we would just get the technology in place to do it and to do it consistently across Scotland. Another big thing is this kind of recognition that there's a huge impact with resourcing and trying to get staffing levels back up to what they were in 2008, which is now going to be even difficult, with budgets likely to all crash with all the councils. But who knows what will happen, so I'll try not to dwell on that too much. But I think improving the proficiency and efficiency of the workforce is always going to be a good thing. And if technology can be used to make people who are working in planning work better and work more efficiently, then I don't see why that could be a problem. I think kind of looking back on reflections, one thing I would say is that it's important that we don't lose skilled staff the way we maybe did in 2008. There was a lot of voluntary redundancies, and I think that's really quite key that we keep the skilled staff members on board to support the younger planners as well. Yeah, so I appreciate that COVID-19's forced everyone to start using technology and using it more, and that maybe the systems weren't in place that people would have wanted, and some places have done it better than others. But a lot of places have done really well, and I don't think that can be given enough credit, how adaptable everyone's been and how much the technology has worked. So I think I would hope this would take a bit of the fear out of moving online for a lot of people and a lot of companies. So hopefully it'll only be good things.
Yeah, no, completely agree with you, Rhiannon. I've got big hopes that given the amount of time we've all been spending either in our homes or certainly walking around and interacting with friends and family in our local areas, I really hope planning and the benefits it brings to place and communities because of that time will remain high on the political agenda, notwithstanding the competing demands, and then it continues to get the investment that it deserves. Fingers crossed on that front.
I think certainly for some of the councils that have perhaps been a little more cautious in embracing some of the technologies, perhaps waiting to see if it would all get back to normal a bit sooner, as it becomes apparent that that's not going to be the case. I think of necessity, they're going to have to take a move in that direction for meetings and all of the different things that councils have been doing. But if I can perhaps just butt in at this point, keeping an eye on the Q&A. And I might say, apart from some hostility arising in relation to Geraint's Everton mug, which I think comes from one of your colleagues, so don't worry too much about that. Going back to the youth class question that we posed earlier on, I think the feedback is really all very supportive towards more flexibility coming through in Scotland. I think in a similar way, one of our listeners is picking up on perhaps a hint coming out of Glasgow City Council in their recent draft city development strategy, that there'll be a relaxation in their policies towards more non-retail use in their traditional sort of core retail areas, but perhaps some concern about that message filtering through to development management in the way that they are approaching their tasks, and it may take quite a sort of change of thinking in that particular section of the department, but just flagging up really the need for that changed approach in parts of the city which are suffering. And I think that message being echoed from others, saying that really a serious refresh of the youth class order being long overdue in Scotland. Town centres have moved on, so that's the message that's coming through from the listeners today. So Geraint, just pass back over to you at this point. I think you've got
as is become a bit of a tradition on this at the moment. A couple of quick fire questions for you, though I suspect we've kind of touched on the answer to one of them. Your chief planner for the day, what's your first move and why?
Resourcing, protecting staffing levels. I think too often planning is just seen as a burden, as red tape, and I think that's because a lot of the time planners are under so much pressure to get stuff done and they don't have time, or it's too often stuff designed out because there's not the time or the resources to actually really properly think about things and implement it. So definitely more staff. More planners.
And I think, as has been very evident throughout in terms of your enthusiasm for the subject matter, given your role and experiences, what would your advice be to somebody who's perhaps looking to get into the profession or is just starting out, aside from signing up to the Scottish Young Planners Network? What would you advise somebody?
Just really get out and about and meet other planners and chat with them and see what they do and what they think of the profession. I think it's, in my experience, it's quite rare you come across a planner who doesn't enjoy what they're doing or have something good to say about the profession. So we're a friendly bunch. I think if you're thinking about it, just have a go, see what there is to do, do that bit of research, remember it is a really broad discipline, so there's so many different parts you can get involved in. So yeah, definitely just reach out.
And we can hear about the Scottish Young Planners Network, presumably via website, email updates.
Yeah, so it's all on the RTPI's website. It's got our own wee separate Young Planners page. Sign up to the RTPI Scotland's bulletins, and there's a Young Planners one that goes out as well.
Good stuff. So if you haven't already signed up, it's highly recommended. So there we have it. Lots of reasons to remain optimistic and enthusiastic for the future of planning. I think, as ever, it seems that the key for planning and for all of us and our viewers as planning professionals is how we achieve getting that balance right between being a positive tool to facilitate growth in the right way, whilst not being unduly restrictive and constraining people's opportunity. As we know, there are examples where planning in recent times has struggled to keep pace with the changing dynamics of our cities, Airbnb or short-term letting being one such example. I think the discussion around what's happening in England to inform what could be happening in Scotland is very welcome. And I say the Glasgow planning policy document that has been produced, which Karen had touched on, it's quite an interesting read when you look at when that was produced and where we are now and where we're looking to go to. So I think it's probably leaves Glasgow pretty well placed to at least have more of an informed discussion. Some other places in Scotland to, as we progress through into this new normal. So yes, watch this space. It'd be interesting to see what happens, and I'm sure we're all looking forward to engaging and doing battle with it in the future. So it falls for me just to say a big thank you from all of us at Brodies to Rhiannon and to our virtual audience for joining us this afternoon. Not forgetting our BD team who've made this possible and shown huge quantities of tolerance, patience and understanding with us. Before we log off, a reminder that you can catch us again in 3 weeks' time on the 17th September, when we'll be back for another instalment of the Brodies Planning Podcast live and interactive, for which an official invite will be sent out in due course. If anyone has any questions, suggestions or topics, or indeed would like to feature as a guest for future episodes, do send us an email or give us a call. We'd be delighted to hear from you. And as I said earlier on, if there's any questions that we haven't addressed, we'll catch up with Karen after this and we'll see if we can get back to you on those. So until then, it's goodbye from us all. Have a good evening and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.
Thanks.